So popular books as well as unpopular laws stirred the emotions of the people of all regions. The most influential book of its day was a novel about the conflict between a slave named Tom and the brutal white slave owner Simon Legree. This is Uncle Tom's Cabin, published in 1852 by the Northern writer Harriet Beecher Stowe. And it moved a generation of Northerners, as well as many Europeans, to regard all slave owners as monstrously cruel and inhuman. Southerners really condemned the book. They said that it was full of untruths in the novel. They looked upon it more as proof that the North had some sort of incurable prejudice against the Southern way of life. So later, when Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, he's reported to have said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." There's a very controversial excerpt from Uncle Tom's Cabin in your primary source anthology. So the response to that from the South is this book by a man named Hinton Helper called The Impending Crisis of the South. It attacked slavery from another angle. Helper was a native of North Carolina, and he actually used statistics to demonstrate to his fellow Southerners that slavery had a negative impact on the South's economy. Southern states acted very quickly to ban his book, but it was still widely distributed in the North by anti-slavery and free soil leaders. And so also responding to that Northern literature that condemned slavery as a terrible evil, you've got a lot of pro-slavery whites in the South that counterattacked by arguing that slavery was actually just the opposite. They argued that slavery was a positive good for both the slave and the master. They argued that slavery was sanctioned by the Bible and was firmly grounded in philosophy and history. A lot of Southern authors contrasted the conditions of Northern wage workers, wage slaves they called them, because they were forced to work long hours in factories and mines, with the familial bonds that would develop on plantations between slaves and master. So probably the boldest author from this view was George Fitzhugh, because he questioned the principle of equal rights for what he called unequal men. And he attacked the capitalist wage system as being worse than slavery. And among his works were Sociology for the South and Cannibals All. And I believe there's also an excerpt from this in your primary source anthology. So signs of trouble for the Whig Party were apparent in the 1852 election for president. The Whigs nominated another military hero of the Mexican War, General Scott, Wingfield Scott. And the Whig campaign just completely ignored the slavery issue and instead concentrated on the Whigs' plans for improving roads and harbors, which seemed kind of innocuous in this campaign. Scott soon discovered that sectional issues could not be held in check because the anti-slavery and Southern factions of the party basically fell apart because there was so much quarreling going on. So the Democrats nominated Franklin Pierce, who, as you know, will become president if you saw the previous video. And Pierce was a Northerner who was kind of acceptable to Southern Democrats because of his support for the fugitive slave law. So in the Electoral College vote, Pierce and the Democrats won all but 4 states. And this proved to be a sweep that kind of showed that the days of the Whig Party were numbered. So with the Democrats firmly in control of national policy, both in the White House and in Congress, a new law was passed that was to have disastrous consequences, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois devised this plan for building a railroad and promoting Western settlement, while at the same time increasing the value of his own real estate holdings in Chicago. Douglas needed to win Southern approval for his plan so he could build a transcontinental railroad through the central United States, and he needed a major station to be in Chicago. a lot of those Southern Democrats preferred a more southerly route for the railroad. So Stephen Douglas obtained Southern approval for his railroad route by introducing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act proposed that the Nebraska Territory be divided into the Kansas Territory and the Nebraska Territory, and that the settlers there be free to decide whether or not to allow slavery. Again, that's called popular sovereignty. So since these territories were located north of the 36-degree, 30-minute north line from the Missouri Compromise, Douglas's bill would give Southern slave owners an opportunity that previously had been closed to them by the Missouri Compromise. So there's months of bitter debate. Both houses of Congress will eventually pass Douglas's bill as the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, and President Pierce signed it into law. Passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act really renewed the sectional controversy. That sectional controversy had sort of been partly resolved by the Compromise of 1850, but in effect, the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820. Northern Democrats condemned the law as a surrender to the slave power. And furthermore, a new political party emerged, whose membership was entirely Northern and Western, and its overriding purpose was to express opposition to the spread of slavery in the territories, and that's the Republican Party. So, in hindsight, it's clear that the breakup of truly national political parties in the mid-1850s paralleled the breakup of the Union. The new parties came into being at this time, one temporary, the Know-Nothings, and the other permanent, the Republicans. Both played a role in bringing about the demise of the Whigs. So let's start with the Know-Nothings. Kind of in addition to the sectional divisions between North and South, there's also this growing ethnic tension in the North between native-born Protestant Americans and immigrant Germans and Irish Catholics. Nativist hostility to these newcomers led to the formation of the American Party, or the Know-Nothing Party. Nativism is discrimination against anyone who's not a native-born American. The Know-Nothing Party got its nickname Know-Nothing because party members would commonly respond, "I know nothing," to political questions. The Know-Nothings would draw a lot of support away from the Whigs at a time when that party was reeling from its defeat in the 1852 election. Their one burning issue was opposition to Catholics and immigrants, because in the 1840s and 1850s, those immigrants were entering northern cities in large numbers. So although the Know-Nothings won a few local and state elections in the mid-1850s, and they helped to weaken the Whigs, they quickly lost influence because sectional issues became paramount over issues of immigration. So the Republican Party was formed in Wisconsin in 1854, basically in reaction to the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It's a coalition of free soilers and anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats that will make up this new party. And the platform of 1854 for the Republican Party called for the repeal of both the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Fugitive Slave Law. So although abolitionists were later to join the party, the leaders were chiefly Northern and Western moderates who were sort of united in their opposition to slavery in the territories. They were pretty content to see slavery continue so long as it was confined to those old slave states of the South. And it's from 1854 to 1860 the Republican Party will grow really rapidly in the North. Soon it's going to establish itself as the second largest party. But because it remained strictly a northern or sectional party in the 1850s, its success really only alienated and threatened the South. So the election's first major test of strength came in the presidential election of 1856. Their nominee for president was the young explorer and pathfinder John Fremont. who was a senator from California. The Republican platform called for no expansion of slavery, free homestead, and a pro-business protective tariff. The Know-Nothings also competed really strongly in this election, and they won about 20% of the popular vote for their candidate, who was former President Millard Fillmore. And the one major national party, the Democrats, were still expected to win, and they nominated James Buchanan of Pennsylvania. They rejected both President Pierce and Stephen Douglas because they were too closely identified with that controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act. So just as expected, the Democratic ticket won a majority of both the popular and electoral vote. And the Republicans did make a remarkably strong showing for a sectional party. So in the Electoral College, Fremont carried 11 of the 16 free states. And it was becoming evident that the anti-slavery Republicans could win the White House without actually getting a single vote from the South. So the election of 1856 foreshadowed this whole emergence of the powerful political party that would win all but 4 presidential elections between 1860 and 1932. So the conflicts between anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces were not really confined to politics and public debate. By the mid-1850s, both sides resorted to violence. So well before the 1856 election, the tragic and bloody consequences of the Kansas-Nebraska Act had become obvious to all. Stephen Douglas, who was the sponsor of the measure, expected the slavery issue in the territory to be settled peacefully by those anti-slavery farmers from the Midwest who migrated to Kansas. These settlers did in fact constitute a majority of the population, but slaveholders from the neighboring state of Missouri would start setting up homesteads in Kansas, chiefly as a means of winning control of the territory for the South. Northern abolitionists and free soilers responded by organizing the New England Emigrant Aid Society, which ended up paying for the transportation of anti-slavery settlers to Kansas. So fighting soon broke out between the pro-slavery and the anti-slavery groups, and the territory would then become known as Bleeding Kansas. A lot of pro-slavery Missourians, which were sort of mockingly called border ruffians by their enemies, crossed the border to create a pro-slavery legislature in Lecompton, Kansas. Anti-slavery settlers refused to recognize the government and created their own legislature in Topeka. So in 1856, pro-slavery forces attacked the free soil town of Lawrence, killing 2 and destroying homes and businesses. 2 days later, John Brown, a stern abolitionist from Connecticut, retaliated for the Lawrence incident and then led his sons on an attack of a pro-slavery farm settlement. The Browns brutally killed 5 settlers. So in Washington, the Pierce administration sort of kept aloof from the turmoil in Kansas, and it didn't really do anything to keep order in the territory. It also failed to support any kind of honest elections in Kansas. So as Bleeding Kansas became bloodier, the Democratic Party became even more divided between its northern and southern factions. And in Washington, D.C., you've got this congressman named Senator Charles Sumner, who would verbally attack the Democratic administration any chance that he got. In one of his speeches, he actually included personal charges against a South Carolina senator named Andrew Butler. So Butler's nephew, Preston Brooks, defended his absent uncle's honor by just walking right into the Senate chamber and then beating Sumner over the head